Not far off, the aging poet Francisco de Quevedo walked with sharp eyes, bent and frail, but still perceptive. He leaned toward a companion. "Look into the king's eyes," he murmured. The youth obeyed, then nodded. "There is sorrow, an emptiness. It is the weight of a dying bloodline," Quevedo replied. "No crown can shield him from it." Elsewhere, whispers swirled. Maria de Cardona, maid to the queen, leaned to her mother, a long-serving court lady. "The queen fears tonight," she murmured. "She's heard troubling things about the king's body." Her mother hushed her but confirmed the rumors privately. Malformed genitals, possible sterility, whispered afflictions of a line bound too tightly to itself. As midnight approached, the couple was ceremoniously led toward their chambers. This was no private moment, though not directly witnessed. The act was encased in tradition and expectation. Carlos, frail and dazed attendants, undressed him, perfumed him, and gave another potion, spiced and laced with supposed aphrodisiacs. He drank without objection. Maria Luisa was similarly prepared by her ladies, her gown removed, hair combed and perfumed, reassured with quiet counsel. "Remember, your majesty," urged the Duchess of Terranova, her chief attendant. "The fate of Spain rests upon this night." The young queen nodded nervously. In a nearby chapel, monks prayed fervently. Father Mateo de Moya, the king's confessor, begged heaven, "Grant our sovereign strength, O Lord, courage to fulfill his sacred charge." Yet even he wondered silently if Carlos's suffering was itself a divine message, that perhaps heaven willed the dynasty to end. In his study, Dr. Juan Bautista Guanini, the king's physician, wrote notes by candlelight. A man inspired by the newer schools of medicine in France and Italy, he attempted to introduce modern remedies to the Spanish court. Yet he met constant opposition from traditionalists, who clung to the belief that illness stemmed from imbalanced humors or the work of demons. "The king's condition is not spiritual nor humoral," Guanini scribbled. "It is structural. It arises from repeated consanguineous unions, which do not dilute flaws but intensify them." His observations were centuries ahead of their time, too advanced for his contemporaries, but they would later be confirmed by science. At dawn following the wedding, curiosity buzzed throughout the palace. No public inspection of the nuptial sheets was conducted, out of respect for royal dignity, but gossip ran unchecked. The marriage had not been consummated, not that night, nor for many afterward. The whispers grew. Carlos was either too frail, too frightened, or entirely incapable. Anxiety rippled through Europe's courts. Without an heir, speculation over succession intensified. Spain's throne, and with it a global empire, seemed destined to fall into contest. As weeks stretched into months, then into years, pressure only mounted. Foreign physicians arrived with new concoctions, strange herbs, metallic tinctures, even alchemical mixtures. Some promised marvels. None succeeded. They attempted baths in the blood of bulls and chickens, even more exotic beasts. Talismans were smuggled in, exorcisms performed in secret. One bizarre ritual required bathing the king's loins in the fresh blood of a goat, yet nothing changed. Carlos's condition remained. If he carried seed, it yielded no life. Over the years, hope itself waned. Much later, modern genetics would reveal the truth. Carlos likely carried multiple disorders, perhaps Klinefelter syndrome, perhaps androgen insensitivity. Such conditions explained his features, his slow development, and most damning, his infertility. By 1689, a decade into a barren marriage, Maria Luisa of Orleans suddenly died at 26. The official cause ruptured appendix, yet whispers said she had simply lost the will to endure. Carlos sank into despair, but duty gave no time for grief. Within months, he married again, this time to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess famed for her fertile family. Her mother had birthed 23 children. Still, the match produced nothing. In the gardens of El Buen Retiro, the royal botanist, Jose Cueri Martinez,
starting in the morning here, so everyone else up to.
Tended his collection of medicinal
About
plants
to take a
with
dab
quiet
and drink
focus.
some tea.
Over the years, he had noticed a peculiar pattern in his experiments. When the same plants were crossbred too many times, their offspring weakened, more prone to blight and disease. "It is as though nature resists inbreeding," he murmured to himself, never realizing how closely his botanical instincts.
It's the ghost King Boo from Mario. Hell yeah.
Mirrored the tragedy unfolding in the palace. Not far away, Carlos II sat slumped on a stone bench, his gaze drifting upward to the birds wheeling across the sky. Despite his frailties, there were brief moments when the king seemed aware of the cruel irony of his life. A sovereign unable to govern, a husband incapable of fatherhood, a ruler stripped of the one legacy expected of him. Sometimes I dream of a son, he once confided to his confessor, a strong boy to carry my name, but perhaps God does not wish it. The priest remained silent. How could he reveal that the king's fate was not divine will but human folly, centuries of politics overriding biology, sealing his destiny long before his birth? By the 1690s, the Spanish court had turned inward, desperation hovered over every decision. Physicians clung to rituals steeped in superstition, priests blamed devils, courtiers whispered of curses, but nothing could halt the inevitable. On the morning of November 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled once more. Carlos II, last sovereign of the Spanish Habsburg line, was dead at 39. His body, wasted by a lifetime of disease, was placed in the royal chapel. One of his doctors, Juan de Cabriada, stood in silence before the corpse. He had watched the king suffer through seizures, infections, digestive collapse, and finally failure of the kidneys. An autopsy was ordered, rare in such cases. The results startled even hardened physicians. The body lacked blood, the heart was no larger than a peppercorn, the lungs decayed, the intestines gangrenous. Only one testicle remained, blackened and shriveled, while the skull's cavity brimmed with fluid. Medicine of the age could not explain it. To later generations, the conclusion was clear. This was the terminal stage of dynastic self-destruction. Even hope had died. The court assembled in the Alcazar to witness the reading of the king's last testament. The atmosphere was charged as the notary cracked the seal and prepared to declare the chosen heir. All present held their breath as a single name emerged. Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, a Bourbon. The French envoy allowed himself a smirk, while the Austrian ambassador scowled in open displeasure. The struggle for Spain's succession had begun. Yet beneath the maneuvering of diplomats and the clashing of dynasties lay a truth none dared to speak aloud, but all understood. The Spanish Habsburg line had reached its natural end. The so-called purest blood in Europe had become its most brittle. This once great dynasty collapsed not through conquest, but through its own design, a ticking genetic time set centuries earlier. Carlos II
This is the Omen, a classic slip-on shop boot loaded with modern comfort and performance features. So let me walk you through it. We'll start on the outside and work our way in. As you'll see here, we got that grippy rubber outsole. This thing is EH rated, slip and oil resistant, non-marking, and it's high heat resistant.
How much, man?
Yeah, sure. So as far as
Drinking some hot apple cider. I'm making some chicken for breakfast. And planning out my day. Deciding if I should get some dabs later. I need to make a list of some stuff I gotta buy. What's up, Logical? How's it going? Wait, what? No. Steve is so weird sometimes. No Man's Sky. Nice. That's a cool game. I used to watch my friend play that. What's your favorite part of that game right now?
yeah, sure. So as far as I'm aware, I think this is kind of the open, more the open part of the debate. And
Yeah.
I suppose that My response to these kind of things, it's best for categories for things to be specific. I suppose that's true in a lot of cases. It doesn't mean that when categories become more nebulous, they necessarily become less useful in a lot of things.
Awesome.
I can
So
come up
what's
with some-
gender? Just tell me what.
The marble corridors of the Roman imperial palace ran red with blood on January 24th, 41 AD. 13 knife wounds ended the life of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The emperor history would remember as Caligula. His own guards murdered him, then hunted down his wife and infant daughter, ending the family line with brutal finality. For Rome's Praetorian Guard to turn against their emperor required something extraordinary. What could drive the empire's most loyal soldiers to such desperate action? The answer lies in 4 years of systematic cruelty that transformed Rome from the world's greatest civilization into a theater of horror. The man's descent into madness nearly destroyed an empire. Caligula ascended to power in 37 AD amid tremendous popular support.
What?
The young emperor was the great...
That sounds dope. Shit. I'm hiding. I'm never gonna do shit getting stoned. What the fuck? Damn. That sounds dope, bro. Yeah, I gotta get back into gaming. It's been a minute since I've played anything. That sounds fun. Wait, so if that guy finds you on his ship, will he kill you or something?
grandson of Augustus and son of the beloved General Germanicus, gravely ill with what historians believe was encephalitis, a brain inflammation that can cause permanent personality changes. When he emerged from his sickbed in October 37th AD, the
I guess that's what keeps it interesting. And the threat of being kidnapped.
benevolent young ruler had vanished. In his place stood a monster who would spend the next 3 years proving that there were no limits to human cruelty. The transformation began subtly. Caligula started attending executions
Yeah, I gotta look up the dispensaries near me and see if they got deals for today or for tomorrow. Because tomorrow's Super Bowl Sunday, and I might there's this burger place that has deals going on, so I'm gonna go there tomorrow for food. And then I'm gonna get a free subscription to what state? I'm in Oregon. He just kidnapped me? Shit, man, where's he taking you to, man?
personally, something previous emperors had delegated to subordinates.
Damn.
He would arrive at the gladiatorial arena early in the morning and stay until the final prisoner had been dispatched. Ancient historian Suetonius recorded that Caligula demanded executions be carried out slowly, insisting that victims feel themselves.
He just dropped you off like, here, live here now. Remember back in the count, remember back in count, shares, pin, remember Big Bubba? I think I remember Big Bubba. He got released, gonna blow your back out over that honey bun you never got him back for. I don't eat honey buns. You must have the wrong. I know Big Bubba, but it must be a different Big Bubba. All I eat in jail is hot Cheetos. It's my only thing.
Was dying. His favorite command to executioners became infamous throughout Rome. Strike so that he feels he is dying. This wasn't justice or even political necessity. This was a man discovering that he could inflict suffering without consequence and learning to crave it. The Senate watched nervously as their emperor's attendance at executions became daily routine. They had no idea this was merely the beginning. Caligula soon tired of watching others inflict pain. He wanted to participate directly, and he wanted an audience. he began ordering executions during dinner parties, transforming what should have been refined social occasions into nightmares. Guests would arrive at the palace expecting food, wine, and conversation. Instead, they were forced to watch as prisoners were tortured to death between courses. The emperor would laugh and joke.
Now that's some wild shit right there.
While men screamed, sometimes offering commentary on the executioner's technique. Suetonius describes how
This dude would be eating dinner. That's wild as hell.
Caligula would turn to his dinner guests and ask if they were enjoying the entertainment, making it clear that the wrong answer would be fatal. Senators learned to smile and applaud as human beings were destroyed before their eyes. To show disgust meant death. To show pity meant death. Survival meant becoming complicit in horror. The emperor's cruelty extended beyond anonymous prisoners. He began targeting Rome's elite families with psychological torture designed to maximize suffering. When a senator's son was accused of conspiracy, often on fabricated evidence, Caligula would have the young man executed, then immediately summon the father to dinner. The grieving parent would be forced to sit at the emperor's table, eating and drinking while their child's body was still warm. Caligula would make jokes.
Bro, why don't they make a movie about Caligula? This would be a sick-ass fucking movie.
Conversation, asking about family matters, discussing politics, behaving as if nothing had happened. According to Dio Cassius, if the father showed any sign of grief or refused to smile, Caligula would have him executed on the spot for disrespecting the emperor. Some fathers endured this torture successfully, maintaining composure while their
HBO
hearts
series
shattered.
Rome?
Others broke down.
Fuck. Must be good, huh? I'm slipping. I'll put that on my watch list, though.
And were killed. Either way, Caligula won. He had discovered that death was not the ultimate punishment. Living with unbearable loss while pretending everything was normal could be far worse. The imperial games became showcases for Caligula's creativity in inflicting suffering. Traditional Roman executions, while brutal, were usually quick. Criminals might be beheaded, strangled, or thrown to wild animals, deaths measured in minutes. Caligula found this unsatisfying. He wanted his victims to suffer for hours while remaining conscious. He developed a signature method. Prisoners would be tied to posts in the arena, then beaten systematically with heavy chains. The executioners were trained to strike hard enough to cause excruciating pain, but not hard enough to render the victim unconscious. Session lasted 4 to 6 hours. The crowd would hear every scream, watch every convulsion. When Caligula felt the prisoner had suffered sufficiently, he would signal for the final blow. Sometimes he would wait until the victim begged for death, then order the beating to continue. Caligula's treatment of prisoners destined for the beasts revealed his particular genius for cruelty. Being torn apart by lions, bears, or wild dogs was already among Rome's most feared punishments. The emperor made it worse. He ordered that prisoners' tongues be cut out before they entered the arena. Ancient sources suggest 2 reasons for this modification. First, Caligula found the screams disturbing when he was trying to eat lunch while watching the games. Second, and more tellingly, he believed that watching silent suffering was more entertaining than hearing cries for mercy. Imagine the horror, being pushed into an arena with starving animals, feeling their teeth and claws rip into your flesh, wanting to scream but producing only gurgling sounds as blood fills your mouth. Spectators reported that the silent thrashing of tongueless victims was far more disturbing than traditional executions. Caligula had found a way to make the unbearable worse. Not satisfied with existing methods of execution, Caligula invented new ones. The most notorious was sawing victims in half lengthwise, starting at the groin. This method had occasionally been used in ancient times, but was considered too barbaric even by Roman standards. Caligula revived it and made it a regular feature of his reign. The process was designed to maximize conscious suffering. The victim would be hung upside down with legs spread apart. Two executioners with a long saw would begin at the groin and work their way up toward the head. Because the victim was inverted, blood continued flowing to the brain, keeping them conscious far longer than seemed possible. Medical knowledge of the era understood enough about blood flow to make this intentional. Victims reportedly remained aware until the saw reached their chest cavity. The entire process could take 30 minutes or more. Caligula would watch closely, sometimes offering suggestions on saw speed or technique. The emperor's cruelty wasn't limited to criminals and political enemies. He began targeting random citizens to demonstrate that no one was safe. Suetonius records an incident where Caligula was walking through the marketplace and noticed a balding man. For no reason except whim, he ordered the man seized and had him fight in the arena against a gladiator. The terrified citizen had no combat training and was quickly killed. On another occasion, Caligula saw a man he considered too handsome and had him disfigured with a branding iron across the face. A merchant who complained about high taxes was thrown to the animals. A woman who glanced at him wrong was publicly stripped and beaten. These random acts of violence created an atmosphere of constant terror. Every Roman citizen learned that drawing the emperor's attention for any reason could be fatal. People began avoiding public spaces where Caligula might appear. The emperor reserved special torture for those who had once held power. Roman senators, men who had ruled provinces and commanded armies, were subjected to calculated humiliation designed to destroy their dignity before killing them. Caligula would force elderly senators to run behind his chariot for miles in the summer heat. These were men in their 60s and 70s, many suffering from age-related ailments. They would struggle to keep pace as the emperor urged his horses faster. When senators collapsed from exhaustion, Caligula would have them dragged behind the chariot until dead. Other times, he used senators as human furniture. During banquets, distinguished noblemen would be forced to kneel on all fours, while Caligula used their backs as footstools. If their arms shook from exhaustion, they were beaten. If they collapsed, they were executed. The message was clear.
Bro, I forgot how crazy this shit was.
In Caligula's
Holy
Rome,
shit.
even the highest-ranking citizens were objects for his amusement. Religious authority had always limited Roman emperors' power. The Senate might grant political authority, but only the gods granted legitimacy. Caligula decided to eliminate this limitation by declaring himself a living god. He ordered temples built in his honor and demanded that all citizens worship him. This wasn't mere egotism. It was a calculated move to claim absolute authority over every aspect of Roman life. Citizens who refused to acknowledge Caligula's divinity were guilty not just of political rebellion, but of blasphemy. The punishment for such offense was torture designed to last days. Victims would be kept in the...
And it could, that's crazy, They probably could have, had a better society if they weren't doing all that. I don't know, man.
palace dungeons where Caligula had installed...
They had so much wealth and shit, but then they had to be all fucking... I don't know, man.
all specialized equipment. Ancient sources mention heated metal plates, crushing devices, and implements designed to break bones slowly. The emperor would visit personally to watch.
The whole torture thing is pretty wild, but I don't know. Can't imagine growing up in that time.
The torture sessions, sometimes bringing dinner guests to observe. Those who recanted and worshipped him might be granted a quick death. Those who refused would suffer until their bodies simply gave out. Caligula's sexual violence was as systematic as his physical torture. He considered every man, woman, and child in the empire to be his property, available for his use whenever he desired. He would attend weddings and, if he found the bride attractive, order her brought to the palace immediately. The marriage would be annulled, and the woman would be kept in Caligula's quarters for days or weeks before being returned to her family. if she was returned at all. Dio Cassius records that Caligula raped the wives of several senators, sometimes forcing the husbands to walk.
He was just fucking everyone. Just fucking everything, killing everything.
This wasn't about sexual desire. It was about demonstrating power. The message was clear. Caligula could take anything he wanted from anyone, and there was no recourse. Men whose wives were violated faced an impossible choice: accept the humiliation silently, or complain and be executed along with their entire families. The emperor extended his sexual predation to men as well. Ancient Rome had complex views on same-sex relations, but Caligula's actions went far beyond accepted practices. He raped senators, military officers, and young men from noble families.
He raped senators. He's like, come here, senator. I don't agree with you. I'll rape you.
According to Suetonius, he once had a young nobleman stripped naked and beaten when the man resisted his advances. When the young man's father complained, Caligula had both father and son executed.
That's my problem with the HBO series, probably. Like, they don't go into... They gotta show all this shit. They gotta show every single, like, every true detail. And they can't leave out anything. They gotta show everything that happened.
Then confiscated their property. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern designed to break down Roman social structures. By demonstrating that he could sexually assault anyone regardless of status, gender, or age, Caligula was proclaiming that traditional Roman values of dignity and honor no longer existed. In his empire, there was only power and submission. Families who complained about the rape of their members faced annihilation. Caligula didn't simply execute complainers, he destroyed entire family lines. When one senator objected to the emperor's treatment of his daughter, Caligula had the senator, his wife, all their children, their grandchildren, and even distant cousins rounded up and executed. The killings were done publicly in the arena, with family members forced to watch each other die. Children were killed before their parents' eyes. Parents were killed while their children screamed. The final...
So, Diddy is like the new Caligula, pretty much. He can fuck anyone he wants. He can kill anyone he wants.
surviving family
It's pretty deep.
member would be left alone, grief-stricken and broken, as a living warning to others. Sometimes Caligula would show mercy to this last survivor, a mercy that was its own form of torture, condemning them to live with the memory of their family's destruction. At times, he would have them executed weeks later, extending the psychological torment. Caligula's cruelty extended to the empire's infrastructure and economy. When he ran low on funds for his extravagant lifestyle, he invented crimes to confiscate property from wealthy Romans. A merchant might be accused of treason based on the flimsiest evidence. Perhaps he was overheard criticizing imperial policy, or a slave was tortured into providing false testimony. The merchant would be executed, and his entire estate would become imperial property. Caligula used these confiscations to fund ever more elaborate displays of cruelty. He built specialized torture chambers beneath the palace, equipped with devices designed by engineers he forced into service. These chambers included cells too small to stand or lie down in, where prisoners slowly went mad from the discomfort. The rooms featured elaborate mechanisms for inflicting pain, racks that could be adjusted to increase tension gradually, heated floors that could be made hot enough to burn, but not hot enough to kill quickly, and restraint systems that held victims in positions that became agonizing over hours. The emperor's engineers were forced to innovate in horror. Caligula demanded new methods of execution, pushing his craftsmen to design ever more elaborate death machines. One device stretched victims between two posts, then slowly increased the tension until joints dislocated and ligaments tore. The process could be adjusted to take hours. Another mechanism used weights to gradually crush the victim's chest, reducing their ability to breathe until they suffocated over the course of a day. Perhaps most ingenious was a cell that slowly filled with water. The victim would be chained inside with water trickling in from above. Over 12 to 24 hours, they would watch the water level rise, first to their ankles, then their waist, then their chest. They would have hours to contemplate their approaching death by drowning. Caligula would sometimes visit these prisoners to watch their psychological deterioration as the water rose higher. The palace dungeons became Caligula's laboratory for studying human suffering. He wasn't content merely to kill. He wanted to understand the limits of human endurance. He would have prisoners subjected to the same torture method repeatedly, timing how long they survived, noting when they lost consciousness, recording their final words. Ancient historians suggest he kept detailed records of these experiments, though no such documents survive. Physicians were forced to attend torture sessions to keep victims alive as long as possible. Doctors who had spent their careers healing were now required to use their knowledge to prolong suffering. If a victim showed signs of dying too quickly, physicians would administer stimulants. If shock threatened to render them unconscious, medical intervention would keep them aware. These physicians lived in constant moral agony, knowing that refusing orders meant their own torture, and that obeying made them complicit in atrocities. Caligula's treatment of children was among his most monstrous acts. Roman society held children sacred, viewing them as the future of the empire. The emperor recognized no such boundaries. When he suspected conspiracies among the nobility, he would have suspects children arrested. Boys as young as 8 or 9 would be brought to the palace torture chambers. Caligula believed children couldn't withstand pain like adults and betray their parents. He was often right. Children subjected to torture would say anything to make it stop. But even when they provided no useful information, the torture continued. Caligula seemed to enjoy the psychological torture of parents who would hear their children's screams echoing through the palace corridors. Some parents were forced to watch the torture directly. Others were placed in cells where they could hear but not see, leaving their imaginations to conjure horrors that sometimes exceeded reality. The execution of children followed its own brutal logic. If a family was condemned, Caligula insisted that children die last, forced to watch their parents' executions first. The psychological torment of a 10-year-old watching their mother and father killed before knowing they were next was, in Caligula's view, an additional punishment for the parents. They would die knowing their children would suffer. Ancient sources describe scenes of unbearable cruelty, young children begging for mercy, not understanding what crimes they supposedly committed, while Caligula looked on with amusement. When the Praetorian Guard finally turned against Caligula and hunted down his family, the killing of his infant daughter by smashing her head against a wall was brutally efficient by comparison. A quick death rather than the prolonged suffering the child would have endured had she grown up in her father's care. Military men, Rome's traditional source of honor and strength, were not spared Caligula's cruelty. The emperor harbored a strange relationship with the military. He craved their respect, but resented their independence. When a legion commander questioned one of Caligula's orders, the emperor had the man arrested and brought to Rome. Rather than a quick execution, Caligula subjected the commander to public humiliation. The decorated veteran was stripped naked, painted to look like a woman, and paraded through the streets while citizens were forced to mock him. Afterward, he was kept in a cell barely large enough to crouch in for weeks before finally being strangled. Other military officers who showed insufficient enthusiasm for Caligula's policies were subjected to decimation, a punishment where 1 in 10 soldiers was executed. The condemned men's fellow soldiers were forced to beat them to death with clubs, ensuring that everyone in the unit shared responsibility for the killing. Caligula's paranoia grew alongside his cruelty. He began to suspect conspiracies everywhere, seeing potential assassins in every shadow. His response was to strike preemptively and brutally. Entire families were executed based on the flimsiest evidence of conspiracy. A casual conversation overheard by a slave could be interpreted as treason, A letter mentioning the emperor's health might be construed as hoping for his death. The torture chambers filled with suspects, many of whom had never harbored disloyal thoughts. Under extreme torture, victims would confess to anything, often implicating others just to make the pain stop. This created a spiral of accusations where each tortured prisoner named more suspects, who were arrested and tortured until they named others. Caligula's paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy as Romans who had been loyal began to realize that survival might require the emperor's death. The emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic in his final months. He would order random executions while walking through the palace, having servants killed for minor infractions or imagined slights. A cook who prepared a meal Caligula disliked would be beaten to death in the kitchen. A slave who stumbled while carrying wine would be thrown to the beasts. Palace servants lived in constant terror, knowing that any moment might be their last. This created an atmosphere where normal palace functions became nearly impossible. Servants were too frightened to do their jobs effectively, which led to more mistakes, which led to more executions. The palace became a death trap where simply being present was potentially fatal. Ancient sources suggest that palace staff turnover reached unprecedented levels, with servants fleeing or being killed so frequently that finding replacements became difficult. Caligula's financial demands grew as extreme as his cruelty. The emperor had drained the treasury that Tiberius had carefully built up, spending massive sums on his perverse entertainments and palace renovations designed to facilitate torture. To refill the coffers, he imposed crushing taxes on every aspect of Roman life. There were taxes on sales, taxes on purchases, taxes on food, taxes on prostitutes, even taxes on public toilets. When citizens couldn't pay, their property was confiscated and they were sold into slavery. Families that had been wealthy for generations were reduced to poverty overnight. The economic devastation rippled through Roman society, creating widespread hardship that affected everyone from wealthy merchants to common laborers. Yet Caligula seemed oblivious to the suffering his policies caused, or perhaps he simply didn't care. When a delegation of merchants came to plead for tax relief, he had them thrown into the arena to fight gladiators without weapons or training. The Senate, Rome's traditional governing body, found itself utterly powerless. Senators who had once ruled provinces and commanded armies were reduced to Caligula's playthings. He would summon the Senate at odd hours, 3 in the morning, during meals, while they were sleeping, forcing elderly men to rush to the palace at the emperor's whim. Once assembled, Caligula might keep them waiting for hours before appearing. Sometimes he would address important matters. Other times, he would simply mock them, asking if they enjoyed being woken up and dismiss them without discussion. Senators who showed any sign of irritation were marked for execution. The institution that had governed Rome for centuries became a theater for Caligula's amusement, with distinguished legislators reduced to props in his games. Ancient historians record that many senators began preparing suicide plans, preferring a dignified death by their own hand to the torture and humiliation that awaited those who fell from imperial favor. As 40 AD turned to 41 AD, it became clear that Rome couldn't survive much longer under Caligula's rule. The treasury was empty despite crushing taxation. The military was demoralized by the humiliation of its commanders. The Senate was paralyzed by fear. The population was terrorized into submission. Even Caligula's own household began to turn against him. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, watched as Caligula's madness spiraled out of control. These were men who had witnessed and participated in the conquest of nations, who had seen the brutality of warfare. Yet even they were disturbed by Caligula's casual cruelty. When the emperor executed Praetorian officers on suspicion of conspiracy, the Guard realized that even their loyalty wouldn't protect them. If Caligula would kill his own protectors, no one was safe. The conspiracy that would end Caligula's reign came together quietly over several weeks in late 40 and early 41 AD. The key conspirators were Cassius Chaerea and Cornelius Sabinus, both Praetorian tribunes. Chaerea had particular reason to hate Caligula. The emperor had repeatedly mocked him for having a high-pitched voice, giving him obscene watchwords, and making crude jokes about his masculinity in front of other soldiers. For a military man, such humiliation was unbearable, but Chaerea's personal grievances were augmented by genuine concern for Rome. He watched as the empire his grandfather had fought to build was turned into a torture chamber. Other Praetorian officers joined the conspiracy, along with several senators and palace officials. The plot required perfect timing. Caligula was usually surrounded by guards, and any assassination attempt that failed would result in torture and execution for everyone involved. The conspirators needed to catch the emperor alone, or with minimal protection, in a location where escape was impossible. The opportunity came during the Palatine Games on January 24th, 45 AD. Caligula attended the theatrical performances, watching from the imperial box while surrounded by his usual heavy guard. The conspirators knew they couldn't strike in the theater. Too many loyal soldiers, too many witnesses, too much chance of failure. They needed to wait for Caligula to move to a more isolated location. In the early afternoon, the emperor decided to return to the palace for lunch. Rather than taking the main corridors with their heavy guard presence, Caligula chose to walk through a narrow underground passage that connected the theater to the palace. This passage was used by actors and servants. It was dimly lit, relatively isolated, and perfect for an ambush. As Caligula entered the passage with only a few attendants, Cassius Chaerea and the other conspirators made their move. The assassination was brutal and personal. Chaerea struck first, driving his sword into Caligula's shoulder. The emperor cried out and turned to see his attacker. For a moment, the man who had inflicted such suffering on others faced his own mortality. Caligula tried to speak. Ancient sources suggest he attempted to identify himself as if his position would protect him. But the conspirators had moved beyond fear of imperial authority. A second conspirator, Cornelius Sabinus, stabbed Caligula from behind. Then the others closed in. Swords rose and fell in the narrow corridor as the Praetorian Guard killed their emperor. 30 wounds, the historical sources are specific about this number, riddled Caligula's body. Unlike the prolonged torture the emperor had inflicted on so many, his death was relatively quick. Within minutes, the man who had terrorized Rome for 4 years lay bleeding on the stone floor of an underground passage. The attendants who had accompanied Caligula fled, spreading word that the emperor was dead. The conspirators knew their work wasn't finished. Caligula had a wife, Caesonia, and an infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. As long as they lived, they represented a potential rallying point for Caligula's supporters. The Praetorian Guard hunted through the palace, finding Caesonia grieving over her husband's body. Historical accounts differ on exactly what happened next, but the result was clear. Caesonia was executed, likely stabbed to death like her husband. Then the soldiers found the infant Julia Drusilla. What happened to this child exemplifies the brutal logic of Roman political violence. The baby, perhaps a year old, could not possibly threaten anyone, but she carried Caligula's bloodline, and in Roman politics, bloodlines mattered. A Praetorian soldier picked up the infant and smashed her head against a wall, killing her instantly. The act was monstrous, yet in context, it represented a mercy, quick death, rather than the prolonged suffering that had been Caligula's signature. News of Caligula's death spread through Rome within hours. The reaction was not grief, but relief mixed with terror. Citizens had lived in fear for so long that they initially worried this was another of the emperor's twisted games. Perhaps he was pretending to be dead to identify disloyal subjects. Only when the Senate officially confirmed the death and Caligula's body was displayed did Romans dare to believe their nightmare had ended. The celebrations that followed were muted, not because people mourned Caligula, but because 4 years of terror had taught them caution. People gathered in small groups, speaking in whispers about the tyrant's death, afraid that somehow he might return. Parents who had lost children to Caligula's cruelty wept with relief. Senators who had survived by submission breathed freely for the first time in years. Slowly, as it became clear that Caligula was truly dead and not coming back, Rome began to emerge from its collective trauma. The Senate initially hoped to restore the Republic, ending the imperial system that had enabled Caligula's tyranny. But the Praetorian Guard had other ideas. While the Senate debated, the Guard found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified he would be killed along with other imperial family members. The Praetorians declared Claudius emperor, and the Senate, lacking military support, had no choice but to accept this decision. Claudius was a surprise choice. He had a stammer and a limp, disabilities that had kept him out of politics and probably saved his life under Caligula. As emperor, Claudius proved competent and relatively moderate, though that might be because anyone would seem reasonable compared to Caligula. His first act was to order the destruction of Caligula's torture equipment and the closure of the palace dungeons. He released political prisoners, returned confiscated property where possible, and attempted to heal the wounds Caligula had inflicted on Roman society. Caligula's body received minimal honors. There was no grand funeral, no elaborate tomb, no deification ceremony. His corpse was hastily cremated and buried in a shallow grave in the gardens of Lamia. The location was deliberately obscure. Rome wanted to forget Caligula as quickly as possible. His statues were torn down. His name was removed from public monuments. The Senate ordered a damnatio memoriae, an official condemnation of Caligula's memory designed.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand wanting to forget that, but in the terms of history, we gotta remember it.
Trying to erase him from history. It didn't work. Caligula's reign was too horrific to forget, and ancient historians documented his crimes extensively. But the attempt reveals how desperately Rome wanted to move past this dark chapter. The empire that had once slaughtered 160,000 animals to celebrate Caligula's accession now tried to pretend he had never existed. Historical debates about Caligula have continued for 2 millennia. Was he genuinely insane, suffering from brain damage caused by illness? Or was he a calculating tyrant who used cruelty to maintain power?
Shit. Oh shit. They got one about Genghis Khan too. 2 liberals versus 1 conservative bar fight. Harry
Oh, man.
Hell no, this is not shit. The terrifying execution of Margaret Mar.
In the blood-soaked annals of Tudor England, an age where
How Pinocchio died. The original.
Picture
film
this.
was weirdly
It's the
violent.
classic scene in Disney's Pinocchio.
Alright, I must watch the Genghis Khan one. I know exactly what I was thinking about. I was thinking Caligula was pretty brutal, but I remember Genghis Khan being brutal in a different kind of way.
Imagine standing before a conqueror so ruthless that his very name became synonymous with terror across 2 continents. A man who didn't just kill his enemies, but transformed their deaths into performances of calculated horror, designed to echo through history as warnings to anyone who dared oppose him. Genghis Khan's execution methods weren't merely acts of violence. They were instruments of psychological warfare, carefully crafted to break the spirit of entire civilizations before a single arrow was loosed. Today, we delve into the darkest chambers of Mongol justice, where death itself became a weapon more powerful than any sword. The world of the 13th century was brutal by any standard, but Genghis Khan elevated cruelty to an art form with purpose. Born as Temujin around 1162 in the harsh steppes of Mongolia, he would unite the fractious Mongol tribes and forge the largest contiguous land empire in human history. His conquests stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, encompassing territories that would today include more than 30 modern nations. Yet his military genius was matched only by his willingness to employ terror as a strategic tool. The executions he ordered were never random acts of sadistic pleasure, but deliberate messages inscribed in blood and suffering. Understanding Khan's execution methods requires grasping the cultural and strategic context of Mongol warfare. The steppes produced warriors for whom mercy was a foreign concept, where survival itself depended on absolute dominance over enemies and the natural world alike. Genghis Khan inherited this harsh worldview and refined it into a philosophy of conquest. He believed that resistance to Mongol rule deserved the most severe punishment imaginable, while those who surrendered peacefully would be spared. This binary approach to justice created a system where execution methods served as both punishment and propaganda, designed to convince cities and kingdoms that submission was preferable to the horrors that awaited those who fought. The Mongol legal code, known as the Yasa, codified many of Khan's principles regarding crime and punishment. This remarkable document, though only fragmentary records survive, established clear guidelines for when execution was warranted and sometimes specified the methods to be employed. Interestingly, the Yasa showed surprising leniency in some areas. Theft of small amounts could be forgiven, and religious tolerance was mandated throughout the empire. However, crimes against the state, betrayal, and resistance to Mongol authority demanded the ultimate penalty. The executions that followed were not haphazard brutality, but carefully considered demonstrations designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Perhaps the most infamous execution method attributed to Genghis Khan was the practice of bloodless execution for nobility and royalty. According to Mongol tradition and shamanic beliefs, royal blood was sacred and should not be spilled upon the earth. This superstition led to one of history's most bizarre execution techniques. Victims would be wrapped tightly in carpets or felt blankets, and then trampled to death by horses or crushed beneath heavy objects. The Shah Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire, though he died fleeing Khan's forces, exemplified the type of ruler who might have faced this fate. His son, Jalal ad-Din Mingburnu, witnessed numerous Khwarezmian nobles executed in this manner after their capture.
Damn, trampled by horses would be kind of wild.
Contemporary chroniclers, particularly Persian historians who documented the Mongol invasion.
What does this plus and minus mean? Question mark. I was thinking of voting betting on the Seahawks, but would it be smarter to go for the Patriots? Question mark.
Described these carpet executions with horrified fascination. Atta Malik Juvaini, a Persian historian who served under the Mongols, wrote extensively about their conquest methods. He recorded that noblemen would be rolled so tightly in felt or carpets that they could barely breathe, then placed in the path of Mongol cavalry units conducting maneuvers. The thunder of hundreds of hooves would gradually crush the life from the victims, a process that could take many agonizing minutes. The psychological impact on witnesses was devastating. Seeing their leaders reduced to shapeless bundles, hearing muffled screams gradually fade to silence, watching the carpet slowly flatten and darken with blood that never touched the ground. The reasoning behind this method extended beyond mere superstition. By avoiding the shedding of blood, the Mongols believed they prevented the victim's spirit from seeking revenge in the afterlife. Additionally, this form of execution was deeply humiliating for the victim, denying them an honorable warrior's death. In the martial cultures of Central Asia and the Middle East, dying in battle with weapon in hand was considered the highest honor. To be wrapped helplessly like a piece of furniture and crushed without even seeing one's executioners represented the ultimate degradation. It stripped away every shred of dignity and transformed powerful rulers into anonymous casualties, their final moments defined by helplessness and suffocation in darkness. Another execution method that showcased Khan's strategic cruelty was the practice of pouring molten silver or gold into the eyes and ears of captured officials. This particularly horrific fate was often reserved for corrupt administrators, tax collectors who had exploited their positions, or governors who had betrayed their oaths. The symbolism was unmistakable. Those who had been blinded by greed and deafened to the suffering of their people would experience a literal manifestation of their crimes. The Mongols understood the power of poetic justice, and this execution method served as both punishment and cautionary tale to other officials throughout the empire. The most detailed account of this execution method comes from the fate of Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, who precipitated the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1218, Inalchuk made a fatal error. He seized a Mongol trade caravan, executed the merchants, and confiscated their goods, claiming they were spies. When Genghis Khan demanded justice, Shah Muhammad II refused to surrender the governor, instead executing Khan's ambassadors, an unforgivable insult in Mongol culture. The subsequent invasion devastated Central Asia, and when Otrar finally fell in 1220 after a 5-month siege, Inalchuk was captured alive. Contemporary sources describe his execution with gruesome precision. According to multiple Persian and Arab chroniclers, Inalchuk was brought before the Mongol commanders in chains. His fate had been decreed by Genghis Khan personally. Molten silver would be poured into his eyes and ears until death released him. The execution was conducted publicly, with officials from surrounding regions forced to witness. Witnesses described how executioners first restrained the governor completely, holding his head immobile. Crucibles of silver were heated until the metal liquefied, glowing white-hot. The first pour into the ear canal would have caused instantaneous, indescribable agony as the molten metal burned through delicate tissues, boiling away fluids and destroying the inner ear structures. The victim's screams would have been horrific, echoing across the execution ground, serving the Mongols' purpose of terrorizing observers. The molten silver would continue its destructive path, potentially reaching the brain itself, causing seizures and unimaginable pain. Then the process would be repeated with the other ear and both eyes. Pouring molten metal into the eyes would cause the vitreous fluid to boil explosively, and the eyeballs themselves would burst from the heat and pressure. The optic nerves would be instantly cauterized, and the silver would pool in the eye sockets before potentially dripping through into the nasal cavity and throat. Death might come from shock, from the destruction of vital brain tissues, or from suffocation as molten metal flowed down the airways. What made this execution particularly effective?
That would suck. Your eyes explode after burning molten metal gets poured on them? That's fucked up, bro. Good morning, Chris.
As psychological warfare was its duration and visibility. Unlike a quick beheading or arrow to the heart, this death unfolded over several agonizing minutes, allowing...
What up, Brenda? Just learning about the torture methods of Genghis Khan.
The full horror to impress itself upon all witnesses. The victim's body would convulse violently, muscles contracting in response to the trauma, limbs thrashing against restraints. The smell of burning flesh and hair would permeate the area, creating a sensory memory that witnesses would carry forever. And when death finally arrived, the corpse would be left on display, silver tears frozen on the cheeks, metallic streams hardened in the ear canals, a grotesque statue warning others against betraying the Mongol Khan. The strategic brilliance of such executions becomes clear when examining their aftermath. News of Inalchuk's fate spread rapidly throughout Central Asia and the Middle East. Subsequent Mongol campaigns encountered far less resistance from local governors and officials, many of whom chose immediate surrender rather than risk similar punishment. Genghis Khan's investment in spectacular cruelty thus saved Mongol lives and
yeah, I was actually watching this thing about Vlad earlier too. How he had like thousands of impaled people for miles to against the Ottomans and shit. Actually, it was they were talking about Mehmet II and how he was against Vlad. Oh, bug.
accelerated conquests by making potential enemies too terrified to resist. It was terror as military strategy, elevated to a level of sophistication that modern psychological operations would recognize. Another particularly disturbing execution method employed by Genghis Khan involved systematic destruction of a victim's identity and legacy before death. When the Mongols captured Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II's mother, Turkin Khatun, she was subjected to an execution designed to erase her existence. This powerful woman had effectively ruled the Khwarezmian Empire from behind the throne, influencing her son's disastrous decisions that led to the Mongol invasion. Her fate illustrated how Khan's executions targeted not just the body, but the very concept of the victim's historical significance. Turkin Khatun was reportedly sewn into a donkey's hide while it was still warm and fresh. As the hide dried and compacted in the sun, it would slowly constrict around her body, compressing her limbs and torso with inexorable force. This process could take days, during which time the victim would experience progressively increasing pressure, difficulty breathing.
She was sewn into a donkey hide? What? Let the carcass dry around her?
And circulation being cut off to extremities. The symbolism was profound. The woman who had wrapped herself in royal power and victory was now wrapped in the hide of a lowly beast of burden. Status inverted in the most humiliating manner possible. Contemporary accounts suggest that victims of this execution method would be displayed publicly during their slow death, positioned where both Mongol soldiers and local population could observe their gradual deterioration. As the hide contracted, the victims' screams would become increasingly desperate and their breathing more labored. Circulation cut off to the limbs would cause them to swell grotesquely, then turn dark as tissue began to necrotize. The psychological torture of watching one's own body slowly crushed and suffocated, knowing death was inevitable but might be days away, broke even the strongest spirits. Observers reported victims would beg for a swift death, offering information or treasure in exchange for mercy that never came. The removal of identity extended beyond the physical suffering. The Mongols would deliberately obscure records of who the person had been, referring to them only as the one in the hide or similar dismissive terms. No burial rites were performed according to the victim's religious or cultural traditions. Instead, the body might be left where scavengers could reach it or disposed of in unmarked locations. This practice reflected a uniquely Mongol form of execution, the obliteration not just of life, but of historical presence. In cultures where legacy and remembrance were considered forms of immortality, this represented a death more final than physical destruction. The Mongol practice of executing by drowning in a wooden cage represents another example of their psychological sophistication in methods of death. This particular execution was often reserved for those who had violated sacred oaths or committed betrayal against the Khan personally. The victim would be secured inside a wooden cage, barely large enough to contain their body. Then the cage would be submerged in a river or lake. The bars of the cage ensured that the victim could see the surface, could watch the light filtering through the water above them, but could never reach it. This created a unique form of torment, hope constantly visible but perpetually unattainable. Chronicles from the Mongol conquests describe several instances of this execution method being applied to turncoat generals or officials who had sworn loyalty to the Khan and then betrayed that trust. One particularly detailed account involves a Chinese general who had defected to the Mongols, received honors and position, then attempted to sell military intelligence to Song dynasty forces. When his treachery was discovered, Genghis Khan personally ordered the drowning cage as his punishment. The general was transported to the Yellow River, and in front of his former troops, the cage was constructed around him while he stood waist deep in the water. The execution itself was horrifically methodical. The cage, roughly 6 feet tall and 3 feet square, was assembled piece by piece, boards nailed into place while the victims helplessly inside. Once complete, the top was sealed and weights were attached to ensure it would sink but not rest on the bottom. Instead, it would hover suspended in the water column, moved by currents but going nowhere. The victim could see through the gaps between boards as the cage was dragged toward deeper water. He could feel the water rising up his legs, his waist, his chest, knowing exactly what was coming but powerless to prevent it. As the cage was released and began to sink, witnesses described the victim's escalating panic. His hands would grip the wooden bars, shaking them futilely as water rose to his neck, then his chin. There would be a moment, a single crystalline moment, when only his face remained above water, mouth gasping desperately for one more breath, eyes wide with primal terror. Then the water would close over his head, and the real agony would begin. Unlike simple drowning, where unconsciousness comes relatively quickly, the cage allowed the victim to push his face against the top bars, potentially finding small air pockets. This extended the dying process, creating false hope that made each subsequent submersion more psychologically devastating. The drowning process itself is horrifically uncomfortable, even without the added psychological torments. As water enters the airways, the larynx spasms in an attempt to prevent fluid from reaching the lung. This laryngospasm creates a sensation of strangulation, making it impossible to breathe in or out. Panic becomes absolute as the body's most primal need, oxygen, goes unmet. Carbon dioxide builds in the bloodstream, creating a burning sensation throughout the body and an overwhelming compulsion to breathe. Eventually, the laryngospasm relaxes and water floods the lungs. If cold water, this can sometimes trigger a mammalian diving reflex that extends survival time slightly, making the torture last even longer. Inside the cage, the victim might survive for several minutes, consciousness fading in and out as the brain was periodically deprived of oxygen, then received minimal amounts through whatever air remained. Current and wave action would rock the cage, sometimes bringing the top briefly near the surface, creating false hope before dragging it back down. The victim's final moments would be a confused mixture of panic, hallucination, and the sensation of drowning repeatedly. When death finally came, the body would remain in the cage, preserved beneath the water as a warning. The Mongols would sometimes mark the location with stakes or signs, informing travelers that beneath the surface lay one who had betrayed the Khan, a ghost story in physical form. The execution of the Tangut king Li Xian demonstrates perhaps the most psychologically complex method attributed to Genghis Khan. The Western Xia dynasty, ruled by the Tanguts, had repeatedly defied Mongol demands for tribute and military assistance. When Khan finally launched his campaign against them in 1227, he was already in declining health, possibly suffering from injuries sustained in a fall from his horse. His anger toward the Tanguts was personal and profound, and he reportedly swore that their civilization would be completely erased from history. King Li Xian's execution was designed to inaugurate this policy of civilizational annihilation. According to fragmentary accounts preserved in Mongol and Chinese sources, Li Xian was not immediately killed after surrendering the Tangut capital. Instead, he was forced to witness the systematic destruction of his kingdom. City after city was razed, populations massacred or enslaved, libraries and temples burned. The Tangut written language was deliberately targeted for extinction, with scholars who could read or write it hunted down and killed. Li Xian was moved from location to location,
Christ.
always kept alive to watch the obliteration of everything he
Anyone who could read or write the language was killed.
had ruled.
That's wild, bro.
This psychological torture lasted weeks, during which he was well fed and clothed in royal garments, a mockery of his powerless status. The execution itself, when it finally came, reflected this theme of erasure. Rather than a spectacular public death, Li Xian simply vanished from the historical record at a certain point. Some sources suggest he was strangled quietly in his tent one night. Others claim he was given a poison that left no trace. Still others whisper that he was entombed alive in an unmarked location, neither dead nor alive, but simply removed from existence. The very ambiguity seems deliberate. A king whose death was so thoroughly unmemorable that even manner cannot be definitively stated. In a culture that valued glorious deaths and remembrance, this was perhaps the cruelest execution of all. The fate of the Tangut people following their king's death illustrated the full horror of Khan's policy. The Mongol forces systematically destroyed nearly every settlement in the Western Xia territory. Irrigation systems were demolished, fields salted, and populations massacred with a thoroughness that shocked even veteran Mongol warriors. The Tangut language, a unique member of the Burman family, disappeared so completely that modern scholars can only partially reconstruct it from fragmentary inscriptions. Entire architectural traditions, artistic styles, and cultural practices vanished.
So it's between myself, or live with family, or live with other people. Well, I think other people would be the last choice, because, you know, and then family, I've already lived with family, so I think I would rather live by myself. Or like, if I had my own family, like start a new family, maybe that. Pick myself. Yeah, I like myself. It's pretty much the choice.
Within a single generation. This was execution extended from one man to an entire civilization, the ultimate expression of Genghis Khan's power. The practice of death.
Bro, look how thoroughly I'm winning this race. Today is the final race, and I'm in first place with like 21,000 points, and everyone else has like nothing. I'm fucking schooling these kids on Monopoly Go.
By 1,000 arrows, represented one of the more visibly spectacular execution methods in the Mongol arsenal. This method was typically reserved for military leaders who had fought particularly effectively against Mongol forces, and served both as punishment and as a demonstration of Mongol archery prowess. The victim would be tied to a wooden post or frame in an open area, sometimes stripped naked, sometimes left in their armor. Then, at a signal, Mongol archers would begin shooting arrows into their body, carefully aiming to avoid immediately fatal wounds and prolong the victim's suffering. The Mongols were arguably the finest archers in human history, capable of hitting targets accurately from horseback at full gallop. Their composite bows were technological marvels constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that provided extraordinary power and range. An experienced Mongol archer could place an arrow exactly where intended from over 200 yards away. This precision was essential for the 1,000 arrows execution to achieve its intended effect. The victim needed to remain conscious and suffering for as long as possible, which required avoiding immediate kills while ensuring each arrow inflicted maximum pain. Contemporary accounts describe how these executions would begin. The first arrows would target the extremities, feet, calves, thighs, hands, and forearms. Each impact would send shock waves of pain through the victim's body as razor-sharp arrowheads sliced through muscle, scraped bone, and severed nerves. The victim would scream, rolling writhe against restraints and beg for mercy that never came. As more arrows found their marks, the body would become a grotesque pincushion, each protruding shaft quivering with the victim's frantic movements. Blood would begin flowing from dozens of wounds, soaking clothing and dripping into growing pools beneath the post. The psychological dimension of this execution was particularly sophisticated. Victims could see the archers assembling, could watch them test their bows and select arrows from their quivers. They would observe each archer draw, aim, and release, sometimes seeing the arrow in flight during the split second before impact. The anticipation between shots could stretch for minutes, allowing pain from previous wounds to fully register while dread of the next arrow mounted. Some victims would faint from pain or blood loss, only to be revived with water or stimulants so the execution could continue. The process might last hours, with later arrows targeting more vital areas, the chest, abdomen, and finally, when death was intended, the heart or throat. Witnesses to these executions reported lasting psychological impacts. The sound of arrows striking flesh, a wet thunk distinctly different from arrows hitting targets or ground, haunted observers for years afterward. The victims' evolving vocalizations, from defiant shouts to desperate screams to weak whimpers as blood loss and shock progressed, created an auditory memory that traumatized even hardened warriors. The visual tableau of a human body transformed into a bristling mass of arrows.
Most people, I don't know, like, I think I don't know, man. Hard to be around. Well, there's anytime you interact with someone, it's kind of like taxing in some ways. So if I was always surrounded by people, then you would always have to be like influenced by other people or whatever, or like interact with them in some ways. So yeah, I guess that would be harder. So I think it's best for people to just be able to focus on themselves, and not have to worry about other people all the time.
Shafts slumped against restraints.
I mean, if you have a big family or close family or whatever, then I could understand that or whatever.
Served as a powerful warning. The Mongols would often leave the body in place for days, allowing it to be thoroughly observed by local populations before disposal. The execution of Guyuk Khan's political enemies through the crushing platform method reveals another dimension of Mongol execution practices. As Genghis Khan's grandson and eventual Great Khan himself, Guyuk inherited not just the empire, but also the tradition of using executions as tools of political control. The crushing platform was a particularly elaborate contraption. A large wooden platform would be constructed, sometimes ornately decorated to mock the victim's former status. The condemned person would be placed beneath this platform, and then heavy objects, stones, iron weights, sometimes other prisoners or corpses, would be gradually loaded onto the platform from above. The horror of this execution lay in its predictable inevitability. The victim, lying beneath the platform, could hear each heavy object being added above them. They could feel the wood creaking as the weight increased, could sense the pressure beginning to build against their body. The platform itself was designed with a slight give to it, so it would gradually descend rather than collapsing all at once. This meant the victim experienced a slow, progressive crushing, with plenty of time to contemplate what was happening and no possibility of escape or survival. The psychological torture of knowing exactly how one would die, hearing it approach in...
It's so wild. Would you stay where you're at or move? Oh, definitely. Well, yeah, definitely move. If I won the lottery, I'd get a fucking big ass RV and I'd start doing a fucking world tour. I'd hit all of America, and then I'd hit other countries too. And I would pretty much spend all my money on just gas and travel and keeping the RV in nice condition or whatever. And I'd stream it and go on adventures and maybe meet people, or you never know what kind of shit you could do if you had a lot of money to travel.
Incrementally may have been worse than the physical agony itself. As the weight increased, the victim would first feel pressure, uncomfortable but bearable. Then, as more objects were added, that pressure would become painful. Breathing would become difficult as the chest compressed, each breath requiring more effort than the last. The victim would feel their ribs beginning to bend inward, a sensation of being squeezed in a giant's fist. At a certain point,
Yeah, I'd love to visit Ireland and the Grand Canyon for sure. Because right now I've only been Washington and Oregon my whole life, so I haven't seen much of the world in person.
Ribs would begin to crack and break, producing sharp pains that radiated through the torso. These fractures would sometimes puncture internal organs, lungs, liver, stomach, causing internal bleeding that added suffocation and drowning in one's own blood to the list of torments. The final stages of death by crushing are particularly gruesome. As the rib cage collapsed completely, the lungs would be unable to expand, making breathing impossible regardless of the victim's desperation. The heart, squeezed by the compressing chest cavity, would struggle to pump blood effectively. Blood pressure would skyrocket in the head and neck as circulation was impeded, causing excruciating pressure behind the eyes and in the skull. The victim might experience their eyeballs bulging from their sockets, their tongues swelling and protruding from their mouth, capillaries in their face bursting to create a grotesque purple-red complexion. Consciousness could persist through much of this, the brain desperately clinging to life even as the body systematically failed. One of the most psychologically devastating execution methods attributed to the Mongol period was the practice of progressive amputation. This technique was occasionally employed against spies, saboteurs, or individuals who had caused indirect harm to Mongol interests. The principle was straightforward but horrifying. The victim would be kept alive while parts of their body were systematically removed.
I like Washington. It's not too different than Oregon, but yeah, the government in Oregon and Washington needs to change, in my opinion. And I don't know. I just like the environment, but yeah, sometimes the people aren't that great. I don't know, man. But the state, as far as I like the state, and I'd like to visit more places in it.
Moved over a period of days or weeks. Unlike quick dismemberment, this execution was characterized by its deliberate slowness and the medical attention given to keeping the victim conscious and alive through the entire process. The procedure would begin with extremities, typically fingers and toes. Mongol executioners had learned through extensive practice exactly how to remove these appendages while minimizing immediate blood loss. Ligatures would be tightly bound around the digit before removal, cutting off circulation. The cutting itself would be done with sharp knives, often in a joint rather than through bone, to simplify the process. The immediate pain would be intense, a searing, burning agony as nerves were severed and exposed to air. But the psychological damage was perhaps more significant. Watching one's own body parts being removed, losing pieces of oneself, unable to prevent it. After each amputation, The wounds would be cauterized with hot iron or burning oil to prevent fatal bleeding. The smell of burning flesh, one's own flesh, combined with the visual horror of seeing the charred stumps where fingers or toes had been created a sensory nightmare. Victims would then be given time to partially recover, fed and kept hydrated before the next session. This might occur several days later, removing more digits or perhaps moving to larger extremities like hands or feet. The anticipation between sessions was its own form of torture.
Yeah, I want to visit California. I used to think about, like, because I've always been like a, I kind of would like to escape the rain sometimes, so I thought about moving to like Northern California. But, the government and the whole state's just been so fucked for so long. So I don't even know. I feel like I would have to go visit to decide if I would want to move there or not.
Torture, as victims knew another amputation was coming, but not when or what would be taken next. As the execution progressed, the victim would experience a bewildering array of physical and psychological torments. Phantom limb pain, where the brain continues to register sensation from removed body parts, would create confusion and additional suffering. The victim might feel itching, burning, or shooting pains in fingers they could see were gone. Each day they would wake and confront anew the reality of their...
Yeah, Humboldt County, the like northern, where the redwoods are. Feel like it'd be a nice spot. Being nice and warm, but it'd have a lot of trees, so it'd feel like Oregon and Washington to me. I think I'd like it. But yeah, I don't think I think I want to stay on the West Coast to live. Even though I feel like I want to travel other places.
Mutilated state, the stumps and scars a constant reminder of what had been taken and what horrors might yet come. Sleep became difficult as position changes pressed injured areas against bedding, and nightmares of the amputation sessions haunted what little rest could be found. The final stages of progressive amputation executions typically involved removal of larger body parts, forearms, lower legs, eventually whole limbs at the shoulder or hip. Each of these amputations risked fatal shock.
Just not as much as,
and executioners had to
not that often. I've seen a few bands.
The victim's psychological state by this point was typically one of complete dissociation.
But yeah, I just don't go to shows very often.
The mind unable to process the magnitude of the trauma.
I wanted to go to this, it was a Slipknot. They came to pretty close to Portland, but they didn't come all the way to Portland. They came to like southern Washington, and I didn't have a ride to get to their concert. Otherwise I probably would have gone to that one. But if they'd come to Portland, I would have gone. But I need to check the Game Time app or whatever, and that tells me about like local shows coming up.
Others would appear catatonic, and still others would experience breaks with reality, denying that the amputation had occurred or insisting their removed parts were still attached and functional. Genghis Khan's use of execution by exposure in the Gobi Desert represented a form of environmental execution that left no obvious evidence of direct violence.
Damn, it's already fucking almost 4 o'clock here. Time's flying.
Victims would be stripped of clothing and supplies, then abandoned in the desert during appropriate seasons, summer for heat exposure or winter for cold. This method was occasionally used for criminals whose crimes didn't warrant more elaborate executions, or sometimes for religious purposes when the Mongols wished to let heaven decide the fate of an accused person. The cruelty lay not in active torture, but in the inevitable progression of environmental exposure leading to death. Summer exposure in the Gobi Desert subjected victims to temperatures regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Without water, Death from dehydration would typically occur within 3 to 5 days, but the process was far from peaceful. The first stage would involve intense thirst as the body depleted its water reserves. The victim would feel their mouth and throat becoming dry, saliva production ceasing. As dehydration progressed, they would experience headaches, dizziness, and confusion. The skin would become dry and lose elasticity, and the victim might develop a sunken appearance as fluid left the tissues. Severe dehydration creates profound psychological effects. Hallucinations are common as the brain's functioning becomes impaired.
For like modern bands, like the Growlers.
Victims might see mirages of water sources or rescue parties approaching, only to have these visions dissolve into empty landscape. The desperate craving for water would overwhelm all other thoughts, driving victims to attempt to drink.
That's just off the top of my head, but I think there might be another band I like more.
Sand or their own urine in futile attempts to relieve the torment. As dehydration reached critical levels, the cardiovascular system would begin failing. The heart would struggle to pump increasingly viscous blood through constricting vessels, potentially leading to stroke or heart attack before actual death from dehydration.
Yeah, they're good.
Winter exposure in the Gobi presented a different but equally horrific death. Temperatures could plunge to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Without protective clothing, hypothermia would set in within hours. The victim would first experience intense shivering as the body attempted to generate heat through muscle activity. This would be accompanied by numbness in the extremities as blood flow was redirected to vital organs in the core. As core body temperature dropped below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, confusion and poor decision-making would set in. A particularly cruel development, since correct decisions might theoretically save the victim, but their impaired mental state prevented effective action. As hypothermia progressed, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing sometimes occurred. Victims would experience a false sensation of warmth and begin removing whatever minimal clothing they had, accelerating their decline. In the final stages, the victim might adopt a position called terminal burrowing, attempting to crawl into small spaces or under objects in a primitive response to seek shelter. Death would finally come as cardiac arrhythmias.
This one, that's in Bend, Oregon. Damn. This one band I like is coming to Oregon, but it's gonna be in Bend, Oregon, and the ticket price is like about $100. So that's like a no-go. Here's Atmosphere is gonna be at the Roseland Theater, but they're charging $182 to see him. Hell no. Fuck. What you guys thinking? Never pay that. It's ridiculous prices.
Developed in the dangerously cold heart, or as the brain simply ceased functioning at such low temperatures. The corpses of those who died from exposure were rarely recovered, instead becoming part of the desert landscape, their bones eventually scattered by wind and scavenging animals, unmarked and unmourned. The Mongol practice of executing enemy commanders by having them trampled by their own captured horses represents a particularly symbolic method that combined practical considerations with psychological messaging. Horses were absolutely central to Mongol culture and military success. They were partners,
Yeah, I know, and like the worst part is like when they whatever they advertise the ticket as, like this one says $42, they always charge you more than that anyway, so it's like, what the fuck is going on with this shit? That's why I don't go to shows that many. Yeah, that's why I don't go to that many shows anymore. Rather just chill at home and fucking listen to their music. And fucking spend my money elsewhere.
weapons platforms, and wealth. To be killed by horses, especially one's own mounts, represented a profound inversion of...
It's crazy. And 65 would be okay. Well, actually, the last time I paid for a show, it was I was gonna go see Washed Out, and I think I paid maybe $80, but I forgot that the show was that night, so I missed it, and I was pretty mad about that. And yeah, that's why I haven't bought any tickets since then, because I already missed the last show I bought tickets for.
Natural order, and a deeply shameful death. This execution method was occasionally applied to cavalry commanders who had fought effectively against the Mongols, particularly if they were captured with their personal horses. The execution would be conducted in an open area with good visibility, ensuring maximum audience attendance. The condemned commander would be secured to the ground, typically on their back, with limbs spread firmly staked. Their own horses would be brought forward, sometimes agitated by various means, shouting, fire, or simply kept hungry, and then presented with feed just out of reach beyond where the victim lay. The horses, not understanding the situation, would be driven across the victim's body. The first passes might be almost accidental, hooves landing on or near the victim as the panicked animals sought to escape or reach whatever was attracting them. The physical trauma of being trampled is extreme and acute. A single horse hoof carrying a fraction of an animal weighing 900 to 200 pounds can exert tremendous pressure on a small area. When a hoof strikes the torso, ribs crack and shatter. If the skull is struck, the result is typically catastrophic skull fractures with immediate severe brain injury. Limbs struck by hooves would snap, compound fractures sending bone fragments through skin. The victim would experience waves of pain with each impact, their screams and thrashing potentially further agitating the horses and leading to more strikes. What?
Yeah, I guess, but I wouldn't want to pay for that either. I just want to, because that would just be like watching a YouTube video to me. If you can't be there in person. Well, another thing is like if you go to the clubs, like you want to like. Last time I went to see a show, I wanted to like get a drink at the bar, and all I wanted was like one beer, and they were like, "That'll be like $15, bro." I was just like, "Okay, peace out, bro." It's fucking ridiculous, bro. These businesses need to fall, and no one should be paying for that shit. What's up?
Made this execution particularly horrific was its chaotic nature. Unlike more controlled execution methods, there was a random quality to trampling. A horse might miss the victim in time.
I would never pay. You know what I mean?
Entirely on one pass, allowing.
If it's like, you know what I mean, you can go to the store and get a 6-pack for like $10, but they want to charge you $10 for like one beer. Your whole business should be shut down at that point, bro.
Hope to briefly surge, only to have another horse strike a devastating blow.
Well, I'm listening to the torture methods of Genghis Khan. That's pretty interesting. We were talking about like shows, I guess, like the price of concerts and shit.
Moments later, the victim might survive dozens of hoof strikes, each causing individual injuries before a critical blow finally ended their life. The cumulative damage, broken ribs, puncturing lungs and heart, shattered limbs bleeding profusely, abdominal strikes rupturing internal organs, cranial trauma causing brain hemorrhage, would eventually prove fatal. But the path to death was unpredictable and terrifying in its randomness. The symbolic dimension extended beyond the immediate execution, forcing a commander to be killed by their own horses, animals they had trained, ridden into battle, and relied upon for survival, added emotional torment to physical agony. In their final moments, these commanders would look up to see not their trusted companions, but instruments of their destruction. For witnesses, particularly cavalry soldiers,
everything's a price gouging everything. Pantera at a nightclub. From upstairs or a balcony where you have above the band. Nah.
Soldiers from the same army, seeing their commander.
Well, actually, it wasn't at a. I went to see Korn at the Tacoma Dome, and you're pretty much in like the stands on the side. And I was above them, I guess.
His own horses
But it wasn't a balcony.
turned into execution tools, created a powerful psychological message. Everything you rely upon, everything you trust, can be turned against you by Mongol power. It was a demonstration of absolute dominance that transcended mere military defeat. Perhaps the most infamous mass execution attributed to Genghis Khan's forces was the use of human pyramids as crushing devices. Historical sources, particularly from the aftermath of the siege of Nishapur, describe a terrifying practice. Captured enemy soldiers and civilians would be organized into mass executions where layers of living prisoners would be stacked atop each other, the weight of upper bodies crushing those below. This represented execution not as individual punishment, but as systematic slaughter on an industrial scale designed to process thousands of prisoners quickly while maximizing terror. The practical logistics of such executions are grimly fascinating. In one account, following a particularly bitter siege where a Mongol prince had been killed, the Mongol forces allegedly executed the entire population of the city, rather than individual.
Nah, but one time I met the singer of this one band. I got to like give him a hug or whatever, but it was just an emo band, a screamo band from like high school days, and that was on the last day. Oh yeah, rest in peace to that guy.
Individual killings, prisoners were organized into groups of 50 to 100. These groups would be forced into prepared pits or against walls. Then, methodically, Mongol soldiers would force additional layers of prisoners on top of the first layer. As each new layer was added, the weight would increase on those below. The bottom layers would experience progressively increasing pressure as the human pyramid grew higher. The physiological effects would be similar to the crushing platform method, but complicated by the irregular distribution of weight and the movements of those not yet crushed above. The bottom victims with weight settling onto them, pressure building on their backs, chests and heads. As more bodies piled on, breathing would become nearly impossible. Those in middle layers would experience their own crushing while simultaneously contributing to the crushing of those below them. A horrible dual role of victim and unwilling executioner. The screaming would be cacophonous, a massive chorus of agony that observers described as sounding like damned souls in torment. Death.
They're talking about the execution methods of the Khans.
In these mass crushings came from multiple causes. Asphyxiation was common as chests were compressed beyond the ability to draw breath.
Yeah, I watched the first season of The Walking Dead, but nothing after that.
Broken ribs would puncture lungs and hearts. Skulls would crack under the pressure of bodies piled above. Some victims would experience positional asphyxia, where the position of their body prevented effective breathing even without direct pressure on the chest. The dying process would be staggered, with bottom layer victims dying relatively quickly, while those higher up might survive longer, only to eventually succumb as the pyramid was built higher, or as those beneath them stopped resisting and their bodies settled, increasing pressure. The aftermath of these mass executions would be fields of corpses so densely packed that individual bodies were difficult to distinguish. The Mongols would sometimes leave these sites unburied as warnings to other cities, considering resistance. The message was clear and horrifying. Resistance would lead not to honorable death in battle, but to anonymous suffocation beneath the bodies of fellow citizens. This transformation of human beings into mere crushing weight, stripping away all individual identity and dignity, represented perhaps the ultimate expression of the Mongol philosophy that resistance itself was an offense deserving complete annihilation. In examining these execution methods, we confront the disturbing intersection of military strategy, psychological warfare, and human capacity for inflicting suffering. Genghis Khan's approach to executions was never simply about killing. It was about creating such overwhelming fear that future enemies would surrender immediately, saving Mongol lives and resources. From this calculating perspective, each horrific execution was an investment in future conquests. The more terrible the method, the more effective it became as a deterrent. The stories of these deaths spread along trade routes faster than the Mongol armies themselves, preparing the psychological battlefield before a single soldier arrived. Yet we must also acknowledge the human cost of the strategy. Behind each method described here were real individuals who experienced these torments. They had names, families, dreams, and fears. Their final moments were filled with unimaginable agony and terror. The trauma extended beyond the victims to witnesses forced to watch, to communities that lost members in these brutal fashions, and to the generational legacy of fear that shaped societies for centuries afterward. The Mongol approach to execution created a cultural memory of terror that persisted long after the empire fragmented and declined. The practice of execution by being sewn into animal skins with living creatures represents another dimension of Mongol cruelty that combined physical torment
Sounds pretty epic.
with psychological horror. This method, documented in several medieval sources, involved sewing a condemned person into the fresh hide of a large animal, typically a horse or ox, along with various living creatures such as rats, snakes, or insects.
What? They put rats in there?
Would then be left in the sun or near heat
That's
sources,
so fucked.
causing it to contract as it dried, while the creatures inside, driven by hunger or distress, would attack the helpless victim trapped with them. The initial phase of this execution
Eaten by
would
rats?
involve the overwhelming sensory assault.
So you get sewn into the hide of an animal, and then they throw snakes and rats in there to fucking bite you? Get her! Why the fuck would you do that?
Of being confined in darkness
$75?
within the still warm
Jesus
hide
Christ.
of a freshly slaughtered animal. The smell would be nauseating.
Damn, bro. It's not too bad.
Blood, viscera, and the distinctive odor of death mixed with the victim's own fear sweat. The victim would be unable to move significantly, bound within the contracting leather, and would feel the creatures placed inside with them beginning to move. If rats had been included, they would quickly become agitated by the confined space and darkness, their primitive survival instincts driving them to seek escape by any means, including gnawing through the only soft material available, the victim's flesh. Rats possess remarkably powerful jaws and sharp incisors that never stop growing, requiring them to constantly gnaw to keep the teeth worn down. When trapped and panicked, rats become voraciously destructive. They would begin by biting exposed areas, the face, hands, feet, but as desperation increased, they would burrow.
You'd be so fucked, bro. You got rats in there, you got snakes. There's no escape.
Into the victim's body, seeking escape routes. Historical accounts describe victims being literally eaten alive from within. Rats creating tunnels through soft tissue, consuming muscle, fat, and organs. The pain would be indescribable. Dozens of small, sharp teeth repeatedly biting, tearing and consuming living flesh. Nerve endings screaming with each attack. If snakes had been included instead of or in addition to rats, the psychological torment would be even more profound. Many individuals have instinctive fear responses to snakes, and being trapped in darkness with serpents would create overwhelming panic. Depending on the species, the snakes might be venomous, adding the terror of potential envenomation to the horror of confinement. Non-venomous snakes could still inflict painful bites, and their movement across the victim's skin, cool, dry scales sliding over flesh, would be deeply disturbing. The victim would feel the snakes coiling around limbs, moving across their face, potentially entering body cavities, all while unable to see or effectively defend themselves.
Ugh.
The contracting hide added a progressive element to the torture. As it dried, it would tighten like a vice, compressing the victim's body gradually but inexorably. This compression would restrict breathing, increase claustrophobic panic, and force the trapped creatures into even closer contact with the victim. The victim would
Bro, this is insane. The fucking torture they did back in the day is wild.
experience the dual torment of being slowly crushed while simultaneously being consumed or attacked by the creatures sharing their prison. Death might come from suffocation as the hide contracted too tightly to allow breathing, from blood loss and shock as the creatures inflicted cumulative damage, or from sheer overwhelming trauma causing the heart to fail. The execution method known as the boats or scaphism, while more commonly associated with ancient Persians, was reportedly adapted and used occasionally by Mongol administrators in conquered Persian territories. This method involved trapping the victim between two boats or hollowed logs, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. The victim would be force-fed milk and honey, and these substances would also be smeared on their exposed extremities. Then they would be left floating in stagnant water or exposed to sun, allowing nature to inflict the execution through insect infestation and the victim's own bodily functions.
Oh yeah, and there's this other one. This one that he just brought up reminds me of this other one that they used to do. And it was, they didn't stop doing this other one until more recently. It's, tell me about the torture method that they used to do for sailors, where they would like drag them below the boat. And when did they stop using that method?
That method is known as keel hauling. It involved tying a sailor to a rope and dragging them under the hull of the ship, where they would be lacerated by sharp barnacles or potentially drown. The practice was primarily used by the Dutch and British navies during the 17th and 18th centuries. It fell out of favor as naval discipline became more standardized, with the Dutch officially abolishing it in 1853, though it had largely vanished by the early 19th century.
They were doing that fucking torture method until 1853, where they would cut your fucking body up with barnacles. Jesus.
The initial discomfort would be relatively mild, cramping from the confined position, the heat of the sun, and thirst despite the force feeding of milk and honey. However, the milk and honey served a sinister purpose. Force-fed in large quantities, they would inevitably cause severe diarrhea. Since the victim could not leave their position, they would be forced to defecate on themselves, the waste accumulating in the lower boat. This created an environment of unbearable filth and degradation, stripping away human dignity as effectively
Sitting in your own diarrhea as you're bleeding out.
as any physical torture could. The real horror would begin within a day or two as insects arrived. Flies would be attracted to the honey on the exposed skin and the accumulating waste below. They would land in swarms, covering every exposed surface, crawling into the victim's eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. The constant sensation of insects crawling over skin, the sound of their buzzing directly in the ears, and the inability to brush them away would create maddening psychological distress. The flies would lay eggs in any available flesh, particularly around body cavities and in any open wounds. Within days, these eggs would hatch into maggots that would begin consuming the victim's flesh, particularly in the areas constantly soaked with waste. As the days progressed, the victim's condition would deteriorate catastrophically. The combination of exposure, dehydration despite the milk force feedings, infection from the maggot infestation, and sepsis from the constant exposure to waste would create systemic failure. The victim might develop gangrene in their extremities, visible as blackening tissue that would attract even more insects. Fever from infection would cause delirium and hallucinations. The psychological state would shift between lucid awareness of the horror and merciful unconsciousness. Death, when it finally arrived after potentially 2 weeks or more of suffering, would likely come from overwhelming infection, dehydration, or shock. The Mongol practice of executing enemy leaders through elaborate public humiliation before death served multiple purposes: punishment, entertainment for Mongol troops, and demoralization of the enemy population. One particularly detailed account describes the execution of a Turkish sultan who had resisted Mongol demands. Before his death, he was dressed in women's clothing and paraded through the streets of his own conquered capital on a donkey, forced to announce his own cowardice and failures to his former subjects. The psychological devastation of such treatment was intended to completely unmake the victim's identity and status. This public humiliation phase could last hours or even days before the actual execution. The victim would be subjected to constant verbal abuse, spitting, thrown refuse, and physical assault from both Mongol soldiers and the conquered population, many of whom might participate either from genuine anger or from fear of appearing sympathetic to the condemned. The victim would experience the complete collapse of their social identity, transformed from a figure of authority and respect to an object of contempt and ridicule. For individuals whose entire sense of self was bound up in their status and power, this psychological dissolution could be more agonizing than any physical torture. The final execution would sometimes be anticlimactic after the elaborate humiliation, a simple beheading or strangling, but the real purpose had already been achieved. The victim had been thoroughly broken, their legacy contaminated by the images of degradation that witnesses would remember and recount. In societies where honor and reputation were considered more valuable than life itself, this destruction of identity represented a fate worse than death. The victim's family and descendants would carry the shame for generations, and other potential resistors would consider whether they could endure such humiliation, often concluding that surrender was preferable. Genghis Khan's execution methods also included environmental manipulation on a massive scale. When dealing with particularly hated enemies or cities that had killed Mongol ambassadors, an unforgivable offense in Mongol culture, entire cities would be systematically destroyed.
Alright, this is getting crazy, man. Isn't there some kind of a morning show? Or after, I got a genre. This torture's getting crazy. Stuttering joy. I need something more different. Napoleon's Frozen Hell.
December 14th, 1812, Niemen River, Poland. A Prussian general stands at the crossing point. December 14th, 1812, the Niemen River, Poland.
Hostel. Yeah. Saw was pretty good. The first Saw was definitely the best, and the other ones, and same with Hostel. The first Hostel was better than. But yeah, Hostel was a really good series. I tried to tell my dad. My dad, he's really cheap, and he doesn't like to pay for hotels, but he wants to travel. So he's always talking about hostels, but he's never seen the movie. So I try and tell him, like, bro, hostels might be cheaper, but you should watch that movie and be cautious. Hostel was a really great premise.
Silence. No drums, no songs. just the crunch of snow and the rasping of breath. The rest, over 600,000 men, are dead. They lie frozen in snowdrifts along 1,000 kilometers of Russian wasteland. They float face down in the Berezina River. They rot in mass graves outside Smolensk, Vitebsk, Borodino. They were killed by cold, by starvation, by disease, by Cossack lances, by Russian muskets, by their own desperation. Entire regiments that entered Russia with thousands of men returned with dozens. Some units ceased to exist entirely. This is the story of the greatest military disaster in history before the World Wars. This is the story of Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia, and how an empire's ambition was shattered against the vastness of the Russian winter. But here's what most people don't know. It wasn't just the winter that destroyed the Grande Armée.
I don't think I've seen that one. What's the movie where the more people that logged in the movie, the quicker the people die?
That movie is likely untraceable, 2008. In the film, a serial killer creates a website called Kill With Me that live streams murders. The speed and brutality.
No, I've never even heard of that one. But I might add it to my watch list. Untraceable.
The catastrophe was already unfolding in the summer heat, months before the first snow fell. The decisions that doomed 600,000 men were made in palaces and on battlefields, driven by pride, miscalculation, and a fatal underestimation of an enemy's will. Before we begin,
I wish I could watch movies on YouTube, because that would be hella fun. I could just watch, you guys could suggest movies and we could just watch it, and or whatever. But stupid copyright system. Otherwise I would be doing that right now.
need to ask something. If this story reaches you, it's because people like you chose to engage with history that matters. A like or a comment helps this reach more people who need to understand what happened here and why it still matters. The 600,000 men who never came home deserve to be remembered, and more than that,
I could technically do that on Twitch, maybe. I'm not sure. But I would need to make my Twitch more, I'm gonna set it up better.
they deserve to be understood. Now, to understand how it ended in frozen horror, we must go back to where it began. At the height of Napoleon's power, when the world seemed to bend to his will, the French Empire controls the continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Russian border, from Hamburg to Rome, from the Netherlands to Naples. 70 million people live under Napoleon Bonaparte's direct or indirect rule. It is the largest European empire since Charlemagne, and it was built in...
And France has been fucked ever since. Ever since Napoleon, after Napoleon, they've been just completely fucked.
in barely 15 years by a man born into minor Corsican nobility. Napoleon's rise defies probability. General at 24. First consul at 30. Emperor at 35, placing the crown on his own head in Notre Dame Cathedral, while Pope Pius VII watched in silence. The symbolism was deliberate. Napoleon bowed to no one, not even God's representative on earth. His military record justifies the arrogance. At Austerlitz in 1805, he crushed the combined armies of Austria and Russia so thoroughly that the Austrian emperor sued for peace within days.
I think so.
At Jena Auerstedt in 1806, he annihilated the Prussian military machine in a single afternoon. The same Prussian army that had terrified Europe under Frederick the Great. At Wagram in 1809, he defeated Austria again, forcing them into alliance through marriage to Archduchess Marie-Louise. Coalition after coalition formed against him. Coalition after coalition shattered. By 1811, there are no major continental powers willing to challenge France on the battlefield. Except one. But the relationship with Russia is complicated, built on an alliance that both emperors knew was temporary. In 1807, after defeating Russia at Friedland, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander the Van on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The location was neutral ground, neither French nor Russian soil. They talked for hours. Witnesses reported they emerged embracing like brothers, having divided Eastern Europe between them. The Treaty of Tilsit formalized what became known as the Peace of the Two Emperors. It lasted 3 years. The problem was Britain.
Sling blade.
Britain controlled the seas. Napoleon controlled the land.
River's Edge.
Neither could strike the decisive blow against the other.
Let me look these up real quick so I can say if I have seen them or not. Pretty sure I've seen Easy Rider. Easy Rider. Yeah, that's a good one. That's probably worth a rewatch now. Sling Blade. Sling Blade. I don't think I've seen Sling Blade. River's Edge. River's Edge movie. I don't know if I've seen that one either. I like movies that from that time period though, like 80s and 90s movies. I'll put these all on my list.
The English Channel was too narrow to allow French invasion fleets to cross undetected and too well defended to force. After the disaster at Trafalgar in 1805, when Admiral Nelson annihilated the combined French-Spanish fleet, Napoleon abandoned plans to invade Britain directly. Instead, he created the Continental System in 1806, a total economic blockade. Every European nation under French influence was forbidden from trading with Britain. The strategy was strangulation: deny Britain its markets, collapse its economy, force it to negotiate from weakness. It required total compliance across the entire continent. Russia agreed at Tilsit. For 3 years, Russian ports were closed to British goods. But by 1810, the Russian economy was hemorrhaging. Russia's wealth came from exports: grain, timber, naval stores. Britain was the primary market. Without British trade, Russian grain rotted in warehouses. The nobility, whose fortunes depended on agricultural exports, grew restless. Tsar Alexander faced pressure from his own court: lift the blockade or face internal revolt. In late 1810, Russian ports quietly began admitting British ships again. Napoleon knew immediately. His spies reported every violation. He sent diplomatic protests. Alexander replied with vague promises and continued opening Russian trade. Then Napoleon made it personal. In December 1810, he annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, a small German state ruled by Duke Peter, who happened to be Tsar Alexander's uncle. Napoleon didn't even bother with a pretext. He simply declared Oldenburg part of France and evicted the Duke. Alexander took it as the insult it was intended to be.
Trick or Treat. Yeah, I've seen Trick or Treat and Detroit Rock City.
By early 1811, both empires were preparing for war they hadn't yet declared. French troops began concentrating in the Duchy of Warsaw, the Polish puppet state Napoleon had created from Prussian and Austrian territories. Russian armies moved to the western frontier. Diplomatic letters grew colder, then stopped entirely. Both emperors issued ultimatums the other ignored. Napoleon faced a choice: accept Russian defiance of the continental system or enforce compliance through war. Acceptance was impossible. If Russia broke the blockade with impunity, other nations would follow. The entire strategy against Britain would collapse. Napoleon's authority,
Heavy Metal.
built on the principle that his
That's a great movie. Love that movie. That's a good one.
word was law across Europe, would be exposed as hollow. But war with Russia was not like war with Austria.
Hey, so check this out. Fucking everyone knows that the Super Bowl every year triggers a major spike in sex trafficking and prostitution. So it almost seems like a perfect place to send ICE. Yeah, that's a good movie too. The Wall.
Or Prussia. Russia was vast. His marshals knew it. His ministers knew it. Charles the Falcon of Sweden had invaded Russia a century earlier with 40,000 men and returned with barely 4,000. The Swedish king won.
Who is the person with the highest IQ on the earth?
As of 2026, Young-hoon Kim of South Korea holds the highest officially recorded IQ with a score of 276. While historical figures like William James Sidis are often estimated to have had scores between 250 and 300, these figures are widely disputed due to a lack of standardized testing during their lifetimes.
So, can you explain how they determined his IQ?
Young-hoon Kim's IQ of 276 was determined through a combination of high-range intelligence tests and a specific statistical scale. Here is how the score was calculated. Conversion of scales. His score of 276 is based on a standard deviation of 24, SD24. On the more common scale used by most psychologists and Mensa, SD15, this is equivalent to an IQ of 210. High-range testing. Unlike standard IQ tests like the WAIS, which usually ceiling at 160, Kim took several clinical and experimental high-range tests designed to measure extreme intelligence. These tests often use complex pattern recognition, logic, and spatial reasoning that go far beyond standard difficulty levels. Verification. His record was officially recognized in...
Bro, but what are the tests? What are they asking him to determine how smart he is?
To measure an IQ of 276, tests use ultra-difficult high-range assessments that differ significantly from standard school or clinical tests.
You're not saying
These
anything.
tests typically focus on three core areas: verbal analogies, finding deep conceptual links between obscure words or philosophical ideas, e.g., all is one, monism, all is self; spatial reasoning, solving slice and dice puzzles that require mentally rotating complex 3D geometric shapes, or predicting the movement of objects on polyhedrons; mathematical puzzles, identifying intricate patterns in number sequences or solving probability problems that lack standard formulas. Unlike time tests, these are often untimed and can take days or weeks to complete, because the problems are designed to be so complex that speed isn't the limiting factor, raw processing power is. Would you like to see some specific practice questions from these high-range societies?
Since you're saying it could take weeks to determine what the answer is, I doubt the credibility of the test, and I would say that he could have cheated in those weeks.
You're not alone in that. Many psychometric experts share your skepticism. The credibility of scores like 276 is a major point of debate for several reasons. Cheating risks. Since these high-range tests are often taken at home and are untimed, critics argue there is no way to prove the person didn't use outside help, advanced software, or collaboration over those weeks. Extrapolation issues. Most clinical tests only go up to 160. To get a score of 276,
I don't think so.
testers use extrapolation,
Sounds
which
familiar.
is essentially a mathematical guess of how rare a person is. Experts call this statistical nonsense, because you...
Tell me about David Carradine and the show Kung Fu.
In the 1970s series Kung Fu, David Carradine played Kwai Chang Caine, an orphan Shaolin monk traveling through the American Old West. The show was unique for blending martial arts action with Western tropes and Eastern philosophy, often using flashbacks to Caine's training in China. Key facts about the role: casting controversy. The role remains controversial because Carradine, a white actor, was cast to play a character of Chinese descent. Bruce Lee had famously developed a similar concept and was passed over for the part. The character Caine was known for his stoic demeanor and peaceful nature, only using his...
I wish I was born back in the day, like a little bit before the 90s, maybe.
Is considered the greatest military mind in Europe, died in exile. broken by the Russian winter and scorched earth. Napoleon's advisors raised the comparison. He dismissed it. Charles V was reckless, he argued. Napoleon was methodical. Charles V had inadequate supplies. Napoleon would stockpile for months. Charles V underestimated Russian resilience. Napoleon would bring such overwhelming force that resistance would be futile. Most critically, Napoleon believed this would not be a war of conquest. It would be a punitive expedition, a limited campaign to force Tsar Alexander back to the negotiating table. March to the frontier, destroy the Russian armies in 1 or 2 decisive battles, threaten...
Oh, now I gotta ask. How did David Carradine die again?
David Carradine died from accidental asphyxiation in 2009. He was found in a hotel room in Bangkok, Thailand, and investigators concluded his death was the result of a sexual act gone wrong rather than suicide or foul play. Would you like me to look up more details regarding the investigation?
Yeah.
It seems you're thinking about the potential for foul play or tampering during long investigations. Whether it's a high-profile case or a simple test,
What the fuck is she
delays can
talking
definitely raise questions about the...
No, tell me the specifically way he died.
David Carradine died from
Autoerotic?
autoerotic asphyxiation.
Ugh.
He was found in a hotel closet with a nylon rope tied around his neck and genitals, which led Thai authorities and a private pathologist to conclude it was an accidental death during a solo sexual act.
What
Would you
the
like to know
fuck?
more about the official autopsy findings?
Dude, he sounds like he fucking was like a... That's crazy, bro. He tried to bring back the torture, you know? He was like, torture wasn't... He was learning about the torture methods of the Mongols and shit, and he was like, hey, let me do that to myself.
Moscow or St. Petersburg,
Shit's crazy.
dictate terms and return home before winter. 6 months, 8
They found a nylon rope around his genitals. Like, what the fuck?
at most. The same strategy had worked against every other opponent. There was no reason to think Russia would be different. In late 1811,
The world of
Napoleon
shit.
made his decision. Orders went out across the empire. Prepare for the
Can I
largest
get a boom, 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 boom?
military mobilization in history. The target, Russia. The objective, submission. The timeline...
What happened to those Costco people? Are they still alive? Boom!
1812. What he didn't know, what he couldn't conceive, was that Tsar Alexander had already decided he would never negotiate. Not after the first battle, not after the 10th.
Alright, I gotta watch this later. I'm not in the mood for this. I wanna... Where's the news? Like, give me some fucking news or something. What's going on today? This thing sucks. Who's live right now? Movies, podcasts. I'll get a boom, 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 boom. Alright, I'm gonna play some music or something. Fireplace.
In 1010 AD, the most feared warriors on earth.
Food change has been around for 22 years now. Our mission is to significantly
Boom,
reduce
boom,
the loss of life
boom.
and damaged property and the injuries during natural disasters. We do work all over the world, mostly emerging economies, mostly with
Godzilla movies. Oh yeah, those are... I love those too. They got those on Tubi right now. Let me see. I've been doing Star Trek. Yeah, like I've seen most of the Star Trek series. Well, actually, yeah, there's so many that I'm definitely haven't seen them all. But yeah, I think I'm gonna restart my stream because yeah, it's been a minute. So I'll be right back. Master of the Universe. Yep, seen that too. All right, I'll be right back.